The House of Shadows. On a cold, mist-shrouded night, Detective Jack Riley stood before a mansion long forgotten by time, its eerie silhouette barely visible through the thick fog. It was a house that had been abandoned for decades, its dark past whispered about in fearful tones by the few who dared to speak of it at all. The locals called it cursed. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it was alive in ways that no living thing should be. Tonight, however, there was no turning back. A series of gruesome murders had brought Jack to this place, to the very edge of sanity and reason. Somewhere in the darkness, there were answers to be found. But not all questions are meant to be answered, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved. As Jack Riley stepped through the gate, the chilling sensation of being watched crept down his spine, urging him to turn back. But he didn't. The house had a story, and Jack was about to learn just how far its reach went. Into the depths of the supernatural. The first night, Jack Riley had seen many things during his time as a detective. Murder scenes, bloodied streets, and broken lives were all too familiar to him. But as he stepped into the decaying mansion, something gnawed at the back of his mind. It wasn't just the grisly murders that had brought him here. There was something more, something wrong about this place. The mansion stood in the distance, like a decaying monument to something evil. Its windows were dark eyes, staring out over the silent land. The house had stood empty for over 30 years, yet its reputation lingered like a curse, passed down through whispers. And now it had drawn Jack in, as if it knew he was the one who would come. He stood before the iron gates, staring at the darkened windows above. The wind was silent now, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jack paused for a moment. Something felt off. The world seemed quieter than it should have been. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. His job was to investigate the murders. The strange events could wait. With a deep breath, Jack pushed open the rusty gate. As his foot touched the ground, he felt a strange, vibrating chill run through his body. It was like stepping into a living entity. Something cold, dead, and hungry. The door to the house creaked open before he touched it. The mansion seemed to welcome him in, a silent invitation. Jack stepped inside, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, illuminating broken furniture, cobwebs, and dust-coated surfaces. The smell of rot filled the air, sharp and pungent. He took another step, and then another, until he was fully inside. The darkness swallowed him whole. "Oh, not," said the word repeatedly. Suddenly he heard something, a whisper, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't the wind. The house was silent, too silent. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. "Leave." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The whisper seemed to crawl along his skin, slithering into his mind. He turned, but the hallway was empty. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with every second. He reached out to touch Jack. Jack's hand fell empty. And then he heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming from above. Heavy, dragging footsteps. His body went rigid. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be just behind him. He spun around, flashlight in hand, but the hallway was still empty. The air felt thick now, suffocating. It was as if something was drawing near, something waiting for him to make a mistake. The sound stopped abruptly. For a moment there was silence. Then came the door slamming shut behind him. The noise was deafening, a violent crack that echoed through the house, sending a jolt of terror straight to his chest. Jack tried to move, but his feet wouldn't cooperate. He tugged at the handle. The door was locked. No, this can't be happening. The walls seemed to close in around him, the temperature dropping rapidly. He could see his breath now, fogging the air in front of him. The whispering started again, faint at first, then growing louder. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was different now, deeper, raspier, almost human. Jack's pulse quickened as the shadows at the end of the hallway began to shift. Something was moving in the darkness, something that was not quite solid, not quite real. He squinted, trying to focus, but whatever it was retreated into the shadows before he could make it out. The footsteps started again, louder this time, as if the thing was circling him. Panic surged in Jack's chest. He had to get out. His eyes darted around, landing on the staircase. The only way out was up. He bolted for the stairs, but as his foot touched the first step, the lights flickered, and the air seemed to thicken. A cold gust of wind swept past him. He turned to see a shadow dart across the wall, fast, too fast. The hairs on his neck stood up, his breath hitching as his heart slammed against his ribs. And then the voice came again, now directly behind him, a chilling whisper that froze him to the spot. "Jack?" He spun around, but the room was empty. Jack didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The images from the mansion, the darkness, the whispers, the footsteps, haunted his every waking moment. He sat in his car, staring at the mansion, waiting for the courage to return. But deep down, he knew that he had no choice. The murders were linked to this house, and if he was going to solve them, he had to go back. As the night deepened, Jack made his way through the fog, the mansion looming like a silent predator waiting to strike. This time, he was prepared. He brought more than just a flashlight. He brought a gun. But as he stepped inside once more, he realized it wouldn't be enough. Nothing would be enough. The house was different now. The air was thicker, heavier, like it was alive. As Jack moved through the house, the silence was oppressive. He couldn't hear anything except his own breathing, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the hallway where the shadows had moved earlier, but the passage was dark, too dark. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he walked, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. A sudden chill filled the air, and Jack stopped dead in his tracks. He looked around but saw nothing, just the darkness pressing in on him, suffocating him. He gripped the flashlight tightly, his knuckles white with fear. That's when he saw it. A figure, a shadow in the distance, standing at the end of the hallway. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even human. It was wrong. Wrong. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its body shrouded in darkness, its face a blur of shadow. It didn't move, just stood there, watching him. Its presence, suffocating. Jack's heart raced. He was frozen in place, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly reached for his gun. But before he could even raise it, the shadow lunged forward, faster than anything should be able to move. The world went black. Jack awoke in a cold sweat, his body stiff, his eyes wide with terror. He was back in the mansion, lying on the floor where he had fallen. His gun was gone. His flashlight was shattered. But the figure, the thing, was gone. There was only the silence. The whispers started again, louder this time, ringing in his ears, growing into a maddening chorus. The walls seemed to close in around him as the air thickened, pressing down on his chest. Jack tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a voice, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "You should never have come back." The walls seemed to pulse with the words, the house alive with an unnatural energy. And then, everything clicked. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was a trap, a prison, for something far darker than he could ever have imagined. The murders weren't random, they were sacrifices. The house had been feeding on the lives of those who dared to enter, and now it had him. No one ever found Jack Riley. The mansion stood silently, its dark windows staring out over the land, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in. The murders continued, and the house seemed to grow hungrier with every passing year. The whispers never stopped, the shadows never left. And the house, the mansion, waited, its secrets buried deep beneath the floorboards. The reflection. Rachel had never believed in superstitions, ghosts, or anything that didn't have a logical explanation. But even the most rational minds have their breaking points. For Rachel, it all began when they moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town. A fresh start after the chaos that had defined their lives for too long. It was supposed to be a new chapter, a place to heal. But from the moment they set foot inside the house, something felt wrong. The house was beautiful, the walls covered in vintage wallpaper and the creaky wooden floors gave it character. The fireplace was large enough to warm the entire room, and the old windows let in soft, golden light. But there was something about it, a weight to the air, an unsettling presence that lurked just out of sight. In a car in front of them, a vehicle parked in front of the house, in the hallway stood a large full-length mirror, its ornate gold frame adorned with intricate carvings of vines and flowers. Rachel had immediately noticed it when they walked in. There was something about the way it stood there, reflecting the hallway with its quiet, unmoving gaze. It didn't seem to belong, like it had always been there, patiently waiting for something. "Rachel, what do you think?" Jack, her husband, asked, as he placed a box down on the living room floor, his voice hopeful. "This place, it's perfect, right?" Rachel smiled, though she felt a knot twist in her stomach. "It's beautiful, Jack. Perfect for us." The mirror in the hallway refused to leave her mind. Every time she passed by it, she felt its gaze on her, as if it were watching her, waiting. It was an odd sensation, one that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the reflection, it was something else, something beyond that. Something beyond that. Like, the first week in the house passed without much incident. The unpacking was exhausting but satisfying. Rachel tried to dismiss the lingering unease she felt every time she looked at the mirror. It was old, she told herself, and old things sometimes had an unsettling presence. But then the whispers started. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible. Rachel would hear them in the middle of the night, like hushed voices murmuring from the hallway. She would tell herself it was the wind, the house settling, or maybe the pipes groaning. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The voices didn't sound natural, and they didn't stop. One night she got up to use the bathroom, her steps muffled on the old wooden floors. As she passed the hallway mirror, something made her stop. She glanced at her reflection, and for a moment, it didn't seem like her. Her reflection was smiling. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Her own face, her own reflection, was smiling at her. A wide, unnerving grin that she hadn't made. She stepped closer to the mirror, her breath shallow. But the moment she did, the reflection returned to its neutral expression. The same blank stare. She stared at herself, wondering if she was seeing things. "It's just the stress," she thought. "You've had a rough couple of weeks." But the sensation didn't go away. In fact, it only intensified. The next few days were filled with odd occurrences. Little things at first that she tried to dismiss: keys vanishing from their usual spot, books out of place on the shelves, and lights flickering even when no one had touched them. Rachel was starting to feel the weight of something she couldn't quite explain, like an invisible force was pressing down on her, filling the house with an oppressive energy. Jack, of course, brushed it off, saying she was just adjusting to their new life. But one evening, as Rachel was unpacking some boxes in the bedroom, she heard a noise, a soft knock at the door. It was not the kind of knock that came from the wind or a tree brushing against the house. It was deliberate. It was purposeful. She froze, her pulse quickening. "Jack," she called out. "Are you there?" There was no response. She glanced at the door, the old wood creaking as if something was leaning against it. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, before slowly moving toward it. As she reached for the knob, the door suddenly swung open on its own. Rachel stepped back in shock. The hallway was empty. But there, just beside the doorframe, was the mirror. It seemed closer than before. Its reflection now showed the empty hallway, but something was wrong. The shadows in the reflection were too dark, too deep, like they were pulling everything into them. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she noticed a figure in the reflection. Dark, blurred, just out of sight. Her heart hammered in her chest. The figure moved toward her in the mirror, and for the briefest moment, she thought it was reaching for her. She slammed the door shut, her hands shaking as she locked it. The next few weeks only made things worse. Rachel's mind began to unravel as the supernatural occurrences grew more intense. At night, she would hear the soft whispers again, but this time, they were clearer, more insistent. The mirror no longer just reflected the world, it seemed to shape it. The faces she saw in it, once her own, began to change. They were distorted, twisted versions of her family, grinning, their eyes wide with terror. One evening, as she was cleaning the kitchen, Rachel caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hallway mirror. This time, her reflection didn't mirror her actions. She raised her hand to her forehead, and the reflection grinned at her, mocking her movements. Then, it did something strange. It waved. Rachel's skin crawled as her reflection waved back at her, its grin growing wider. Without thinking, she rushed to the mirror, but the moment she touched the glass, a cold sensation ran through her arm. She jerked back, her heart pounding in her chest. When she looked back at the reflection, her own face stared back at her, motionless. But something inside her, some primal fear, told her that it wasn't really her reflection. That thing in the mirror was something else. Something watching. Something waiting. By the time Rachel realized that the house was more than just a haunted place, it was a trap. It was almost too late. She had seen things. The mirror was showing her things that weren't real, people who weren't there. And worst of all, it was starting to show the past. Her reflection began to show images of people who had lived in the house long before her. They were watching her too. One day, she found an old journal hidden under the floorboards in the attic. It was written by a woman named Margaret, the house's previous owner. The entries were frantic, describing a growing obsession with the mirror. Margaret wrote of hearing voices, seeing figures in the reflection, figures that were not her own, figures that began to move. The last entry in the journal was a desperate plea. Go. It's not just the dead I see. It's something worse. It's coming for us all. I've tried everything to destroy it, but it's not a mirror. It's a door. And once it opens, there is no way out. Rachel was no longer alone in the house. The mirror had been watching her, waiting for her to understand its true power. It was not a reflection, it was a portal, a gateway to another world, a dark, twisted dimension where souls were trapped forever. And now, Rachel could feel them reaching out for her, pulling her into the depths of the glass. The mirror was calling, and she was too afraid to look away. Rachel's final scream was swallowed by the mirror. Her reflection, once so familiar, now twisted with terror, smiled as the glass began to crack, its surface swirling like water. The house fell silent, and outside the sun set, casting long shadows on the yard. The mirror was empty once more, its dark, silent gaze lingering on the hallway, waiting for the next soul to come. The Forgotten Village. Olivia Martin had always been drawn to the unknown. As a young journalist eager to make her mark, she often found herself chasing stories that others would shy away from. So, when she heard about the Forgotten Village tucked deep within the forest and abandoned for decades, she knew she had to investigate. The village had long been a subject of whispered rumors, its name barely spoken in the nearby towns. They called it the Village of the Cursed Ones, a place where death had struck in strange, inexplicable ways. She packed her bags, her camera, and her notepad, determined to uncover the truth. The small town she'd driven through was nothing more than a scattering of weathered houses, each with a story to tell. The locals were reluctant to talk, their eyes darting nervously whenever Olivia mentioned the village. One elderly man, his hands shaking as he spoke, muttered, "It's best left alone. No good will come of it." "It's a place where the dead never leave." His words stuck with Olivia as she drove deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the air grew colder. The journey was long, and the road was barely more than a dirt path, hidden beneath the thick canopy of trees. But Olivia didn't hesitate. She was determined to see the village with her own eyes, to uncover its secrets, no matter how dark they might be. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, she arrived. The village was exactly as the man had described it, isolated, forgotten, and eerily still. The houses stood in perfect rows, their whitewashed exteriors glowing faintly in the dimming light. The streets were paved with cobblestones, untouched by time or the elements. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sounds, just the silence of a place that had been lost to the world. As Olivia stepped out of her car, she felt an odd sensation wash over her. It was as though the village was watching her, as if it were alive and waiting. She shrugged off the feeling and began to explore. The houses were perfectly furnished. Old wooden chairs, dust-covered tables, and faded portraits hung on the walls. It was as though the villagers had just up and left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. The air inside each house was thick with dust, but everything appeared untouched, preserved in a way that made no sense. There were no signs of decay, no signs of time passing at all. And she wandered from house to house, snapping pictures, jotting down notes. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world, a place frozen in time. But there was something unsettling about it. The village seemed too perfect, too quiet, as if the world outside had ceased to exist and only this place remained. Olivia ventured deeper into the village, her steps slow and deliberate. She reached the village square where a large fountain stood at the center. The stone was weathered but not cracked, the water in the fountain clear and still. At the base of the fountain was a plaque, its inscription worn and almost unreadable. Olivia knelt down to get a closer look, brushing away the dirt and grime that had settled over the years. The words on the plaque sent a chill down her spine. "Here lie the forgotten souls, whose lives were taken by darkness. May they never be disturbed." Her heart began to race. What had happened here? Who were these forgotten souls? And why had the village been abandoned? The silence around her seemed to close in, as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. Suddenly, a soft sound caught her attention. A faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves, but there were no trees nearby. Olivia's eyes darted around, her pulse quickening. The whispering grew louder, then faded, only to return in a different direction. It felt as if the very air was shifting, as though something invisible was moving through the village. She stood up, her breath shallow, and turned toward the nearest house. The door to it was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. As she approached, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. Olivia stepped inside, her camera at the ready, her mind racing with questions. The house was different from the others. The furniture was more worn, the floorboards creaked under her weight. But it was the air in this house that was different. It was heavier, colder. As she moved through the house, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The house felt wrong, like something was lurking just beyond the corners of her vision. She entered the bedroom at the back of the house and froze. The bed was made, but the air in the room was thick with an unnatural chill. On the walls there were marks, scratches, deep gouges that had been made with something sharp. They circled around the room, forming strange, chaotic patterns. Then, as she moved closer to the bed, something caught her eye. Beneath the bed was a small box. Olivia knelt down, heart pounding in her chest. When she opened it, her breath hitched. Julie continued to stare at Olivia, and only then did she hear her sell. Inside the box was a collection of old, yellowed letters, each one sealed with wax. The handwriting was scrawled, messy and frantic, as though the writer was in a hurry. Olivia picked one up and carefully broke the seal. The letter inside was dated 50 years ago. "We have seen them, the figures that walk in the night. We have heard their whispers, their promises. We are not alone. They want us all." The letter was signed by a name she didn't recognize, but the words, those words, sent a shiver through her spine. She quickly rifled through the rest of the letters, reading snippets of each one. Each one spoke of the same thing, them. The figures that roamed the village at night, the whispers in the air, the creeping feeling of being watched. Olivia's heart raced as she read. These weren't just stories, these were warnings. A noise behind her made her freeze. The door creaked open, though no one was there. She turned slowly, her camera clicking off as she instinctively raised it. The room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners. But there was something in the air now. A presence, a feeling she couldn't shake. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thickening with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The whispering returned, louder now, echoing from every direction. Olivia's vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing at the window, a tall shadow, shrouded in darkness, staring at her with eyes she could not see. Panic surged through her, and she backed out of the room, running toward the door. The whispering grew louder, closer, as if the village itself was calling to her. She stumbled out into the street, gasping for breath. The village was no longer silent. It was alive with the sound of whispers, of footsteps, of something lurking just out of sight. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. The houses were no longer empty. Figures stood in the windows, watching her, their faces hidden in shadow. Olivia ran. She ran without looking back, but the figures followed her, their footsteps echoing behind her, growing closer. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees now towering like dark sentinels, their branches reaching down as though to drag her into the darkness. The village had claimed her. As Olivia drove away, her hands trembling on the wheel, she glanced into the rearview mirror. The village was gone. There was nothing but the empty road stretching out before her. But in her mind, the whispers remained. They followed her. They would never stop. The village was never truly abandoned. It had simply been waiting for the next person to uncover its secrets. And now it had found her.